Montana Territory, 1882, a time when a woman's reputation was her most valuable possession, and scandal could destroy not just a life, but entire futures. For Elizabeth Montgomery, a schoolteacher of 23 years with dreams bigger than the small mining town of Silver Creek, fate would deal an unexpected hand when her stagecoach was attacked by the notorious Wilson gang on a desolate stretch of mountain road. As shots rang out and horses screamed in terror, she never expected to be rescued by Mason Hayes, the mysterious rancher who kept to himself on the outskirts of town. A man whispered about in hushed tones, a former gunslinger with blood on his hands who sought redemption in solitude. What began as a desperate escape from certain death would transform into something neither of them could have anticipated. For, in saving her life, Mason unwittingly condemned Elizabeth to a choice no woman should ever have to make: marry a stranger or lose everything she had worked for. This is the remarkable true story of how one night changed two lives forever, and how what began as obligation blossomed into something neither dared to hope for in the wild Montana frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The schoolhouse bell rang out across Silver Creek, signaling the end of another day. Elizabeth Montgomery gathered her books and papers as her students rushed for the door, eager to escape into the warm May afternoon. At 23, she commanded, respect despite her youth, her posture straight as a prairie fence post, her chestnut hair pinned severely at the nape of her neck. "Don't forget your history essays are due tomorrow," she called after them. "A full page on the Louisiana Purchase." Collective groans answered her, but she noted with satisfaction that not one child forgot to take their textbook. In the 18 months since she'd arrived from Boston, she had transformed this frontier schoolhouse from a glorified daycare into a place of genuine learning. As the last child disappeared through the door, Elizabeth allowed her shoulders to relax slightly. She moved to the window, gazing across the bustling main street of Silver Creek. Despite its name, the town owed its existence not to any scenic waterway, but to the silver mines that pockmarked the surrounding mountains like ant colonies. Miners, merchants, and the occasional cowboy moved through the muddy street, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. Another successful day molding young minds, Miss Montgomery? Elizabeth turned to find Harriet Wilson, the mayor's wife, standing in the doorway. Though barely 40, Harriet carried herself with the gravitas of someone who considered herself the town's moral compass. "I believe so, Mrs. Wilson," Elizabeth replied, automatically straightening her already impeccable posture. Tommy Jenkins finally managed his multiplication tables. "Splendid," Harriet said, though her tone suggested mathematics was the furthest thing from her mind. "I've come to remind you about the town council meeting tomorrow evening. As our school teacher, your presence sets an example." What Harriet didn't say, but what Elizabeth clearly understood, was that her continued employment depended on maintaining the approval of Silver Creek's founding families. Teaching positions for women, especially unmarried women, were precious opportunities, and Silver Creek had taken a chance on her despite her youth. "Of course, I wouldn't miss it," Elizabeth assured her. Harriet's gaze softened slightly. "You've done wonders with the children. My Sophia actually asked for a book for her birthday instead of a new dress, nearly gave her father apoplexy." Elizabeth smiled at the rare compliment. "She has a bright mind." "Indeed." Harriet hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I should mention the stagecoach to Helena tomorrow. Sheriff Thompson received word of the Wilson gang being spotted in the area." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. The Wilson gang, no relation to the mayor's family, had terrorized the Montana Territory for the past year, robbing stagecoaches and occasionally leaving no survivors. "And I'm only going to fetch the new textbooks," Elizabeth said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll be back by nightfall." Harriet nodded, though concern lingered in her eyes. "Just be careful, dear. Perhaps ask if anyone else is making the journey. Safety in numbers, as they say." After Harriet left, Elizabeth sank into her chair, her mind racing. The textbooks couldn't wait. Her students needed them, and the school board had finally allocated the funds after months of her pleading. But the Wilson gang... She shook her head, dispelling the fear. Stagecoaches travelled that road daily. The chances of an attack on her particular journey were minuscule. Besides, she had never been one to let fear dictate her actions. Elizabeth gathered her belongings and locked the schoolhouse, stepping into the late afternoon sunlight. As she made her way down the boardwalk toward her small, rented room above the milliner's shop, her attention was drawn to a tall figure emerging from the general store. Mason Hayes cut an imposing silhouette against the setting sun. At 35, he carried himself with the wariness of a man who had seen too much of life's harsher realities. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and the shadow of a beard darkened his jaw. But it was his eyes that most people noticed, granite gray and watchful, missing nothing. The rumors about Mason Hayes had reached Elizabeth before she'd ever set eyes on him. Former gunslinger, killed a dozen men, running from a bounty. Each story more outlandish than the last, whispered by the town gossips who had never actually spoken to the man. All Elizabeth knew for certain was that he owned the largest cattle ranch outside of town, employed a fair number of locals, and kept to himself. Their paths rarely crossed. Mason came to town only when necessary, and Elizabeth's world revolved around the schoolhouse. Yet occasionally, like today, their eyes would meet briefly across the crowded street, a moment of mutual acknowledgement between two outsiders in a town where family connections stretched back generations. Mason touched the brim of his hat in a minimal greeting, which Elizabeth returned with a slight nod before continuing on her way. That was the extent of their interaction, polite, distant, proper. Later that evening, as Elizabeth prepared for bed in her modest room, she packed a small carpet bag for her journey to Helena. The stagecoach would depart at dawn, returning by late afternoon if all went well. She laid out her second-best traveling dress, navy blue wool that would show minimal dust from the road, and her practical boots. Outside her window, Silver Creek settled into its nightly routine. The saloon. Piano played a jaunty tune, occasionally punctuated by bursts of laughter. Lanterns glowed in windows as families gathered for evening meals. It was a far cry from the refined Boston neighborhood where she'd grown up, but over the past year and a half it had become home in a way she hadn't expected. Elizabeth had come west for the same reason many educated young women did: opportunity. In Boston, she would have remained in her parents' home, expected to make a suitable match and become a society wife. Her teaching certificate would have gathered dust in a drawer. But here she was respected for her mind, her skills, her dedication to her students. Of course, there were trade-offs: the isolation, the hard physical realities of frontier life, the knowledge that one mistake could cost her everything she'd built. Women in positions like hers walked a precarious line, expected to be paragons of virtue, while simultaneously being viewed as curiosities for choosing career over marriage. As she braided her hair for the night, Elizabeth glanced at the small daguerreotype on her bureau. Her parents, stiffly posed but proud on their 25th wedding anniversary. What would they think of her life now? Her father had been scandalized when she announced her intentions to accept the teaching position in Montana Territory. Her mother had cried for days. Their letters, when they came, were filled with news of Boston society and gentle reminders that it wasn't too late to return home, to resume the life they had planned for her. They couldn't understand that the Elizabeth who had left Boston no longer existed. The frontier had changed her, had shown her strength she never knew she possessed. The thought of returning to parlor conversations and elaborate calling card rituals now seemed as foreign as the moon. With a sigh, Elizabeth extinguished her lamp and slipped beneath the quilt. Tomorrow would be a long day, and the stagecoach waited for no one. As sleep claimed her, she had no way of knowing that by this time tomorrow, everything she had carefully built in Silver Creek would hang in the balance, her fate entwined with a man she barely knew. Dawn broke clear and cold over the mountains, the May sunshine not yet strong enough to dispel the night's chill. Elizabeth arrived at the stagecoach office to find she would be traveling with only two other passengers, an elderly mining engineer returning to Helena and a young mother with an infant visiting her parents. The driver, a weathered man named Samuel, who had been running the route for 15 years, helped them aboard with practiced efficiency. "We'll make good time today," he assured them, securing Elizabeth's carpet bag to the roof. "Roads dried out nice after last week's rain." As the stagecoach lurched forward, Elizabeth settled against the leather seat, her copy of Emerson's essays open on her lap, though her mind was already racing ahead to the bookshop in Helena. The new geography textbooks would transform her lessons, allowing her students to visualize a world beyond the mountains that hemmed in their small town. The stagecoach had just begun the steep climb into Thompson Pass, about halfway to Helena, when Elizabeth noticed Samuel repeatedly glancing over his shoulder. The rocky terrain had slowed their pace, the horses straining against the grade. "What is it?" the mining engineer asked, noticing Samuel's unease. "Probably nothing," Samuel replied, though his knuckles whitened on the reins. "Thought I saw dust behind us." Elizabeth's heart quickened as she peered out the small window. At first, she saw nothing but the empty road winding behind them. Then a movement caught her eye. Riders, at least 4 of them, pushing their horses. "Hard up the incline! Faster, Samuel!" the young mother cried, clutching her baby tighter. Samuel didn't need the encouragement. He cracked his whip above the horses, urging them to an even more punishing pace. The stagecoach swayed dangerously as it rounded a sharp curve, the wheels coming perilously close to the edge of the road, where it fell away into a steep ravine. The riders were gaining ground with each passing moment. Elizabeth could now make out details, bandanas pulled up over their faces, rifles glinting in the morning sun. The Wilson gang, just as Harriet had warned. "Everyone down," Samuel shouted as the first shot rang out. Elizabeth threw herself to the floor of the coach, her heart hammering against her ribs. The mining engineer pulled his coat over his head as if the thin wool could stop a bullet. The young mother curled, her body around her infant, tears streaming silently down her face. Another shot, closer this time. The coach lurched violently as one of the horses screamed in pain. Elizabeth felt the sickening sensation of momentum lost, of control slipping away as Samuel fought to keep the remaining horses on the road. "Stop the coach or the next bullet's in your back," a voice commanded. Elizabeth closed her eyes, a silent prayer forming on her lips. In that moment, all she could think was that her parents had been right. She should have stayed in Boston. She should have married the banker's son who had courted her so diligently. She should have chosen safety. Then came the sound that would change everything. More gunshots, but from a different direction. Shouts of confusion from the bandits, the thundering of hooves approaching fast from the ridge above. "It's Mason Hayes!" Samuel's voice carried a note of disbelief. Elizabeth raised her head just enough to see through the window. Mason Hayes rode like a man possessed, his rifle steady despite his horse's breakneck pace. 2 other riders flanked him, ranch hands from his property, she guessed. They fired with precision, forcing the Wilson gang to scatter. For a heart-stopping moment it seemed the bandits might stand their ground. Then their leader, a slight figure on a paint horse, signaled retreat. They wheeled their mounts and fled back down the pass, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Mason reached the stagecoach first, his horse heaving from exertion. "Anyone hurt?" he called to Samuel. Lead horse took a bullet, Samuel replied, his voice shaking. We won't make Helena today. Mason dismounted in one fluid motion, his eyes scanning the area as if expecting the bandits to return. When he reached the stagecoach door, his gaze found Elizabeth's. Recognition flickered across his features. Miss Montgomery, Mr. Hayes, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Your timing is providential. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Providential or not, you folks can't stay here. That gang might circle back once they realize they outnumber us. The mining engineer eased himself from the floor with a groan. The nearest town is hours back. My ranch is just over that ridge, Mason said, gesturing to the north. It's the safest option until we can send word to Silver Creek. Elizabeth knew he was right, but something cold settled in her stomach. Propriety dictated that an unmarried woman shouldn't find herself at a bachelor's residence without proper chaperonage. Yet what choice did they have? As if reading her thoughts, Mason addressed her directly. My housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, will see to your comfort, Miss Montgomery. You have my word. Elizabeth nodded her acceptance, aware that social conventions seemed trivial compared to the very real threat of the Wilson gang's return. With Samuel's help, they unhitched the uninjured horses and secured what luggage they could carry. Mason's ranch hands volunteered to stay with the disabled coach until help could return. The mining engineer rode double with Samuel. The young mother and her baby were settled on Mason's horse, which he led on foot. That left the mount from one of the ranch hands for Elizabeth. As they began the careful journey across the ridge toward Mason's ranch, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing a boundary far more significant than the physical distance to safety. By nightfall, she would be a guest in Mason Hayes's home, the reclusive rancher who was the subject of so much speculation in Silver Creek. She glanced at his broad back as he led the way, wondering what twist of fate had placed her life in the hands of the one man in Silver Creek she had always been most curious about and most careful to avoid. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The journey to Mason Hayes's ranch took nearly 2 hours. Elizabeth's thighs ached from gripping the unfamiliar saddle, and her hands were raw from the reins. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the May day surprisingly warm. Yet she refused to complain, acutely aware that everyone in their small party was suffering similar discomforts after the harrowing escape. Mason led them along a narrow trail that wound through stands of ponderosa pine, occasionally stopping to ensure the young mother and her infant were managing the rough terrain. Elizabeth observed his careful attention to their comfort, noting how it contradicted the callous gunslinger reputation that circulated through Silver Creek's gossip circles. As they crested a final ridge, the Hayes Ranch spread before them, a sprawling property nestled in a protected valley. A substantial 2-story house stood at its center, built of sturdy logs, but with architectural details that spoke of careful craftsmanship. Several outbuildings, a large barn, and well-maintained corrals completed the picture. In the distance, cattle grazed on lush spring grass. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said, the words escaping before she could consider them. Mason glanced back at her, surprise flickering across his features. "It serves its purpose," he replied, though she detected a hint of pride beneath his laconic response. As they approached, a plump woman in her 50s emerged from the house, alarm evident on her face as she took in their bedraggled state. "Mr. Hayes! What on earth?" "Wilson gang, Mrs. Collins," Mason explained, helping the young mother down from his horse. "Attacked the Helena stage. Everyone shaken but unharmed." Mrs. Collins' expression shifted from alarm to efficient determination. "Well, let's get you all inside. I just pulled fresh bread from the oven, and there's stew that can be stretched." The housekeeper's presence eased some of Elizabeth's concerns about propriety. Mrs. Collins had a practical, no-nonsense air about her as she ushered them into the house, clucking over the baby and insisting the mining engineer sit before he collapsed from exhaustion. The interior of Mason's home surprised Elizabeth. She had expected a bachelor's sparse accommodations, perhaps with the careless disorder of a man living alone. Instead, she found herself in a well-appointed home filled with unexpected refinements, bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, a piano in the corner of the sitting room, comfortable furniture arranged for conversation rather than mere utility. "Samuel, I need 2 of your best men to ride to Silver Creek," Mason said, as they settled in the large kitchen. "Sheriff Thompson needs to know about the attack, and these folks have families who'll be worried." Samuel nodded. "I'll go myself. My wife will skin me alive if she hears about this from anyone else." "Take Jackson with you," Mason suggested, "and stick to the main roads. Those bandits are still out there." Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table, a cup of strong tea warming her hands. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. Even if riders left immediately, help couldn't arrive from Silver Creek until well after nightfall. She would be spending the night at Mason Hayes's ranch, an unmarried woman in the home of Silver Creek's most mysterious bachelor. Mrs. Collins seemed to read her thoughts. "Miss Montgomery, we'll make up the guest room for you and the young mother. Mr. Pearson can take the study." She smiled reassuringly. "Everything proper, just as it should be." Elizabeth returned the smile gratefully. "You're very kind, Mrs. Collins." "Nonsense. Can't have you back on the road with those scoundrels about." The housekeeper turned to Mason. "Will you be wanting dinner in the dining room tonight?" "The kitchen will do, Mrs. Collins," he replied. "No need for formality under the circumstances." As Samuel and one of Mason's ranch hands prepared to depart for Silver Creek, Elizabeth stepped onto the covered porch to see them off. The afternoon was waning, shadows lengthening across the valley. From this vantage, she could see the full extent of Mason's property, easily the largest ranch in the territory. It spoke of years of hard work and careful management, another contradiction to the reckless gunslinger image. "I've included a note explaining the situation to Sheriff Thompson," Mason said, joining her on the porch as he handed sealed letters to Samuel, "and one for Mayor Wilson, assuring him of everyone's safety." "Very thorough," Elizabeth observed. A slight smile touched Mason's lips. "I've found it pays to be explicit when dealing with Silver Creek's concerns about propriety." Their eyes met briefly, and Elizabeth felt a surprising jolt of connection. He understood exactly what she had been worrying about: her reputation, her position in the community, the precariousness of her situation. "I appreciate that consideration, Mr. Hayes," she said softly. He nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Collins has prepared rooms. You should rest. It's been a difficult day." Before she could respond, he turned to give final instructions to the departing riders. Elizabeth watched him for a moment longer, struck by the contradictions in this man, who kept the world at arm's length, yet seemed to understand its workings so thoroughly. Inside, Mrs. Collins showed Elizabeth to a comfortable guest room on the second floor. Clean linens, a porcelain wash basin with fresh water, and even a small vase of wildflowers graced the simple but well-appointed space. "There's a dress in the wardrobe that might fit you," Mrs. Collins explained. "Belonged to Mr. Hayes's sister when she visited last year. I'm sure she wouldn't mind you borrowing it while I clean yours." His sister. Elizabeth couldn't hide her surprise. No one in Silver Creek had ever mentioned Mason Hayes having family. Mrs. Collins nodded, a knowing look crossing her face. "People in town don't know much about Mr. Hayes, do they? Like it that way, he does. Keeps to himself." She patted the bed linens with a proprietary air. "Dinner in an hour. Rest until then." Left alone, Elizabeth sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day catching up with her. She had nearly died. The Wilson gang would have shown no mercy. Their reputation for violence was well earned. If Mason Hayes hadn't appeared when he did. She shuddered, pushing the thought away. Instead, she focused on the room around her, finding comfort in observing the details. The furniture was Eastern-made, high quality but not ostentatious. A small bookshelf held a selection of novels and poetry collections. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph of a smiling young woman with Mason's grey eyes. The sister Mrs. Collins had mentioned, perhaps. After washing the dust of travel from her face and hands, Elizabeth changed into the borrowed dress. It was a simple blue cotton, slightly large in the shoulders but otherwise a reasonable fit. Her own travel dress, now spotted with dirt and sweat from their escape, was carefully draped over a chair to await Mrs. Collins's attention. When she descended to the kitchen for dinner, she found the others already gathered. The young mother, Sarah Turner, Elizabeth had learned, sat with her now sleeping baby in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a drawer lined with soft blankets. Mr. Pearson, the mining engineer, was deep in conversation with Mason about recent silver strikes north of Helena. "Ah, Miss Montgomery," Mrs. Collins said, ushering her to a seat. "Just in time, hope you're hungry." The meal was simple but abundant. Venison stew, fresh bread, spring greens, and preserved peaches for dessert. The conversation flowed more easily than Elizabeth had expected, perhaps a result of their shared ordeal. Mr. Pearson regaled them with stories of mining expeditions gone awry. Sarah spoke of her husband's work as a telegraph operator in Helena and her excitement about introducing her infant son to his grandparents. Mason said little, but Elizabeth noticed how attentively he listened, occasionally asking a pertinent question that revealed his interest and understanding. When the conversation turned to the Wilson gang, his expression darkened. "They're getting bolder," he observed. "This is the third stage robbery in 2 months. The newspaper said they're former Confederate soldiers," Mr. Pearson offered. "Unable to settle back into civilian life." Mason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The war ended 17 years ago. That excuse has worn thin." "You served?" Elizabeth asked, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. A brief silence fell over the table. Mason met her gaze directly, something unreadable in his grey eyes. "Union. Cavalry ended the war as a captain." Elizabeth processed this new information. Another piece of the puzzle that was Mason Hayes, not a gunslinger but a veteran, someone who had seen the worst of humanity on blood-soaked battlefields before seeking solitude in the Montana Territory. "My father was with the 20th Massachusetts," she said quietly. "He lost his right arm at Cold Harbor." Something shifted in Mason's expression, a recognition, perhaps, of shared understanding. He nodded once, but offered no further comment. As dinner concluded, Mrs. Collins brought coffee to the sitting room where they gathered around the large stone fireplace. Outside, the temperature had dropped sharply with the setting sun, and the flames provided welcome warmth. Elizabeth found herself unexpectedly comfortable in this strange house with its enigmatic owner. "Do you play, Miss Montgomery?" Mason asked, nodding toward the piano in the corner. "A little," she admitted, "though it's been some time since I had access to an instrument." "Please," he gestured toward the piano. "It sits idle too often." Encouraged by the others, Elizabeth moved to the piano bench. The instrument was well maintained, its ivory keys smooth beneath her fingers. She began with a simple folk melody, her confidence growing as muscle memory returned. Soon, the sitting room filled with music, nothing elaborate but warm and inviting. When she finished, she turned to find Mason watching her, an expression on his face she couldn't quite decipher. "Thank you," he said simply. "This house doesn't hear enough music." Before Elizabeth could respond, the distant sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. Mason moved swiftly to the window, his hand instinctively dropping to where a gun would be if he were wearing one. "Riders," he announced. "At least 4. He reached for a rifle mounted discreetly by the door. "Stay inside." Elizabeth's heart seized with sudden fear. "The Wilson gang?" Mason shook his head. "Sheriff Thompson, looks like. And Mayor Wilson." His voice took on a grimly amused note. "Seems Silver Creek couldn't wait until morning to rescue its schoolteacher." As Mason stepped onto the porch to greet the new arrivals, Elizabeth felt a curious mix of relief and disappointment. Her ordeal was nearly over. By tomorrow she would be back in her small room above the milliner's shop, resuming her ordered existence. Yet something had shifted during these hours at the Hayes Ranch. Some understanding gained, some perspective altered. Elizabeth wasn't yet sure what it meant, but as she heard Sheriff Thompson's booming voice greeting Mason outside, she knew with absolute certainty that she would never look at the reclusive rancher the same way again. What she couldn't possibly know was how quickly her return to Silver Creek would transform from rescue to scandal, and how the coming hours would present her with the most difficult choice of her life. Sheriff Thompson entered Mason's home like a thundercloud, his imposing frame filling the doorway. Behind him came Mayor Wilson, his usual dignified demeanor replaced by tight-lipped concern. 3 other men, members of the town council, followed, their expressions ranging from relief to something that made Elizabeth's stomach clench with apprehension. "Miss Montgomery," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "Thank the Lord you're safe." Elizabeth rose from her seat near the piano. "Sheriff Thompson, Mayor Wilson, I wasn't expecting such a large rescue party. When we heard it was the Wilson gang," Mayor Wilson explained, his eyes darting around the room, as if cataloguing everything in sight, "we thought it prudent to come in force." Mason stood to the side, his face impassive but his posture alert. "Your concern for Miss Montgomery is admirable, gentlemen, but perhaps unnecessary given the late hour. My ranch hands have prepared rooms for everyone. We can all return to Silver Creek in the morning." Sheriff Thompson and Mayor Wilson exchanged a look that Elizabeth couldn't quite interpret. "That won't be necessary, Hayes," the sheriff replied. "We'll be escorting Miss Montgomery and the others back tonight." "Tonight?" Mrs. Collins interjected. "But it's nearly 9 o'clock, and those bandits are still out there." "We're 6 armed men, one of the councilmen, Edward Porter, the banky president, stated flatly, and the moon is full. The road is clear enough." Elizabeth sensed the undercurrent of tension in the room. This wasn't just about safety. Something else was motivating this nighttime retrieval. She glanced at Mason, who was watching the proceedings with a carefully neutral expression that didn't quite mask the wariness in his eyes. "Mr. Porter," Elizabeth began, adopting her schoolteacher's voice of calm reason, "while I appreciate the concern, Mrs. Turner has a young baby. Surely it would be more prudent to wait until daylight." "My husband will be frantic," Sarah interjected, cradling her infant. "If there's a safe way home tonight, I'd prefer to take it," Mayor Wilson nodded approvingly at Sarah. "A devoted wife's proper place is with her husband. The council has already discussed the matter. We ride tonight." The venality in his tone brooked no argument. Elizabeth felt a surge of indignation at having decisions made for her, but years of navigating the delicate position of being an unmarried professional woman had taught her when to pick her battles. "Very well," she conceded. "I'll gather my things." As she turned to head upstairs, she heard Mayor Wilson address Mason in lowered tones, a word in private, Hayes. Elizabeth paused on the stairs, out of sight but within earshot, her curiosity overcoming her better judgment. "Whatever you have to say can be said here," Mason responded, his voice even but with an edge Elizabeth hadn't heard before. "Very well. The mayor's tone hardened. The town council is concerned about the circumstances we've found here tonight. Circumstances? Mason's voice took on a dangerous quiet. You mean the rescue of your citizens from armed bandits? I mean the propriety of the situation, Hayes. An unmarried woman spending hours in your home, wearing what appears to be clothing, not her own. Elizabeth's cheeks burned with indignation and embarrassment. She glanced down at the borrowed dress, suddenly conscious of how it might appear to others. Miss Montgomery's traveling clothes were soiled during the escape. Mrs. Collins interjected, her loyal defense touching Elizabeth deeply. I provided her with a clean dress, while hers is being laundered, as I would for any guest in distress. Your loyalty is commendable, Mrs. Collins, Mayor Wilson replied, his tone suggesting it was anything but. However, appearances matter greatly in a position of moral influence, such as Miss Montgomery's. Elizabeth had heard enough. She descended the stairs with deliberate steps, her chin raised. Mayor Wilson, if you're implying something improper has occurred here, I would remind you that Mrs. Collins has been present at all times, as have Mr. Pearson and Mrs. Turner. Mr. Hayes has been nothing but a gentleman in offering shelter after saving our lives. The mayor had the grace to look momentarily chastened but recovered quickly. No one is making accusations, Miss Montgomery. We are merely concerned with appearances. Silver Creek holds its schoolteacher to the highest moral standard. As you well know, the implication was clear. Her position was at stake. Elizabeth felt cold dread settle in her stomach. She had worked too hard to establish herself in Silver Creek, to lose everything over misplaced suspicions. I'll change back into my traveling clothes, she said stiffly, though they're hardly presentable. That won't be necessary, Mason interrupted. His grey eyes had turned to steel as he addressed Mayor Wilson. Your point is made, Wilson. Miss Montgomery will return with you tonight, and no aspersions need be cast on her character. The mayor nodded, seemingly satisfied. Excellent, Will. Depart within the hour. As the room dispersed into preparation for the journey, Mason caught Elizabeth's eye and motioned toward his study. Against her better judgment, knowing it would only fuel the council's suspicions, she followed him. Mrs. Collins, ever aware of propriety, positioned herself in the hallway within sight, pretending to dust a side table. I apologize for Wilson, Mason said quietly once they were relatively private. He's always been overly concerned with his own importance. It's not your fault, Elizabeth replied. I understand their concern, even if I find it misplaced and insulting. Mason studied her face for a moment. Will this cause you difficulty? In town, the question surprised her with its directness and insight. Perhaps the school board is traditional in its views, but I've proven my value as a teacher. They won't dismiss me over unfounded rumors. She spoke with more confidence than she felt. In truth, she was deeply concerned. An unmarried woman's reputation was fragile currency on the frontier. Once tarnished, it was nearly impossible to restore. If there's any issue, Mason said, his voice low and serious, you have an ally in me, Miss Montgomery. I owe you that. Much for the trouble my intervention has caused. The offer touched her unexpectedly. Thank you, Mr. Hayes, though I suspect your support might do more harm than good in certain quarters. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You're probably right about that. They rejoined the others as preparations for departure neared completion. Elizabeth had changed back into her travel dress, still dusty, but at least properly her own. Sarah Turner and her baby were bundled warmly against the night chill. Mr. Pearson looked exhausted, but resigned to another journey. As they prepared to mount the horses provided by the Silver Creek party, Mrs. Collins pressed a small package into Elizabeth's hands. Sandwiches, she whispered. The ride is long, and men often forget that women get hungry too. Elizabeth squeezed the housekeeper's hand gratefully. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Collins. The older woman glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot. "He's a good man, Miss Montgomery. Better than most. Don't believe everything Silver Creek says." Before Elizabeth could respond, Sheriff Thompson called for her to mount up. Mason helped her onto her horse with impersonal efficiency, careful that the watching councilman could find no fault in the brief contact. "Safe journey, Miss Montgomery," he said formally as he stepped away. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Hayes," she replied with equal formality, "and for your timely rescue today." Mayor Wilson cleared his throat pointedly. "We should be on our way if we hope to reach town before midnight." As their party rode away from the Hayes ranch, Elizabeth found herself looking back at the warm lights of the house receding in the distance. Mason stood on the porch, a solitary figure watching their departure. Something about his stillness, his isolation against the vast Montana night, lodged in her heart in a way she hadn't expected. The journey back to Silver Creek was tense and largely silent. The men formed a protective circle around Sarah, her baby, and Elizabeth, rifles at the ready. The moon provided ample light, turning the landscape silvery and strange. Elizabeth's mind raced ahead to what awaited her in Silver Creek. The news of today's events would spread like wildfire. She could already imagine the whispers, the sideways glances, the concerned parents questioning whether she remained a suitable moral example for their children. As they reached the outskirts of town near midnight, Mayor Wilson maneuvered his horse alongside hers. "Miss Montgomery," he began in a voice that attempted fatherly concern but achieved only condescension, "the town council will meet tomorrow at noon to discuss today's incident." "Incident?" Elizabeth kept her voice level with effort. "You mean the stagecoach robbery attempt, Mayor Wilson?" "I mean the entire situation," he replied stiffly. "Your presence will be required. A council meeting about her conduct." Elizabeth's stomach churned with dread and indignation. "Of course, Mayor Wilson. I have nothing to hide." "I sincerely hope that's the case," he replied, spurring his horse ahead to lead their procession into town. Silver Creek was mostly dark as they arrived, though lights still burned in the saloon, and a few curious faces peered from windows as they passed. Sheriff Thompson escorted Elizabeth directly to the boarding house where she rented her room, an unnecessary gesture that felt more like making sure she was properly confined than genuine concern for her safety. "Council meets at noon," he reminded her gruffly before departing. Elizabeth climbed the stairs to her small room, exhaustion settling into her bones. She lit her lamp and sank onto her narrow bed, finally alone with her thoughts. The day had begun with a simple journey to fetch textbooks. Now she faced a public interrogation about her character and conduct. As she prepared for bed, her gaze fell on the small package Mrs. Collins had pressed into her hands. Unwrapping it, she found not only sandwiches but a folded note. The handwriting was masculine but educated. "Miss Montgomery, should Silver Creek prove less than understanding about today's events, my ranch has need of a teacher for the children of my workers. The position includes a small house of your own. Respectfully, Monsieur Hayes." Elizabeth stared at the note, her heart beating a strange rhythm. He had anticipated the potential fallout and offered her an alternative, a position, independence, a way to continue her vocation without the suffocating judgment of Silver Creek society. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her journal for safekeeping, uncertain whether to feel grateful for the lifeline or disturbed that Mason Hayes believed she might need it. Tomorrow would reveal whether Silver Creek's judgment would force her to consider his offer, and what price. She might have to pay either way. Morning came too quickly. Elizabeth awoke to the sound of the church bell tolling 8, a reminder that despite yesterday's extraordinary events, Silver Creek continued its predictable rhythms. She dressed with particular care, selecting her most conservative navy blue dress with its high collar and pristine white cuffs. Her hair she pinned severely back, not a strand out of place. If her character was to be judged, she would at least present herself as the model of propriety. Venturing downstairs to the boarding house dining room, she was met with an immediate hush in conversations. Mrs. Davis, who ran the establishment, nodded stiffly instead of offering her usual cheerful greeting. Two miners who regularly boarded there suddenly found their breakfast plates fascinating. News had spread then. Elizabeth held her head high as she took her usual seat and accepted a cup of coffee from the serving girl, who at least offered a sympathetic smile. "Is there any word on the stagecoach?" Elizabeth asked Mrs. Davis, attempting normal conversation. "And the injured horse?" Mrs. Davis's pinched expression softened slightly. "Sheriff's men recovered the coach last night. Driver says the horse will recover, though it'll never pull a stage again." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "They're saying those bandits have been spotted heading north. Richardson's farm was raided for horses. So the Wilson gang remained at large, yet the town's primary concern was her propriety." Elizabeth bit back a frustrated comment and instead nodded her thanks for the information. As she finished her breakfast, the bell above the boarding house door jingled. Harriet Wilson swept in, her expression a practiced mixture of concern and determination. As the mayor's wife and self-appointed arbiter of Silver Creek's moral standards, her presence was not unexpected, but still unwelcome. "Elizabeth, dear," Harriet said, joining her without invitation, "I simply had to check on you after your ordeal." "How kind," Elizabeth replied neutrally, noting Harriet's use of her first name, an unusual familiarity that suggested this was not a social call. Harriet leaned in, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that ensured everyone could still hear. "The entire town is talking about what happened. I wanted you to know that I've spoken extensively with the school board members. Many of them feel that, given your circumstances, it might be best if you took a leave of absence." The blood drained from Elizabeth's face. "A leave of absence? For what possible reason? My dear, surely you understand." Harriet's eyes widened in feigned surprise. "A young, unmarried woman spending the night at a bachelor's residence, and not just any bachelor but Mason Hayes. There are parents who are understandably concerned about the example this sets for their impressionable children." Elizabeth set her coffee cup down with controlled precision, fighting to maintain her composure. "Mrs. Wilson, I was the victim of an attempted robbery. Mr. Hayes and his ranch hands saved my life, and those of 3 others. I was chaperoned at all times by his housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, as well as by Mrs. Turner and Mr. Pearson." "Yes, of course," Harriet waved a dismissive hand, "but you must understand how these things appear. Perception is reality in a small community like ours." "No, Mrs. Wilson," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Reality is reality, and the reality is that nothing improper occurred. I would have thought the safety of Silver Creek citizens would take precedence over unfounded gossip." Harriet's expression hardened. "The council meeting at noon will determine the school board's position. I simply wanted to prepare you as a courtesy." "Your concern is noted," Elizabeth said coolly. Harriet rose, adjusting her hat. "One more thing, my dear. Victoria Palmer has expressed interest in the teaching position should it become available. She completed 2 years at a ladies' seminary in Denver, you know." The implication was crystal clear. Victoria Palmer was 22, pretty, docile, and most importantly, the daughter of one of Silver Creek's founding families. She was also engaged to Harriet Wilson's nephew. "How fortunate for Victoria," Elizabeth replied. "Please excuse me, Mrs. Wilson. I have preparations to make before the council meeting." As Harriet departed, Elizabeth remained at the table, her appetite gone. The orchestrated nature of this campaign against her was becoming clear. This wasn't just about propriety. It was about replacing her with someone more malleable, more connected to Silver Creek's established families. Her thoughts turned to Mason's note, tucked safely in her journal upstairs. A teaching position at his ranch, independence from Silver Creek's suffocating judgment. The offer seemed increasingly tempting. With 2 hours remaining before the council meeting, Elizabeth decided to visit the schoolhouse. If this was to be her last day as Silver Creek's teacher, she wanted to ensure everything was in order for whoever followed. The schoolhouse sat silent and empty, Saturday's sunshine streaming through its windows. Elizabeth unlocked the door and stepped inside, inhaling the familiar scent of chalk dust, wood polish, and books. She had transformed this space from a bare-bones frontier schoolroom into a place of genuine learning. Maps adorned the walls. The small library she had started contained over 60 volumes, many donated from her personal collection. She ran her hand along her desk, remembering the first day she had stood before 20 curious children, all watching this Eastern newcomer with varying degrees of skepticism. It had taken months to win their trust, to prove that her methods, while different from the rote memorization they were accustomed to, would serve them better in a changing world. Now it could all be taken away because of one night, one rescue, one twist of fate that had placed her in Mason Hayes's home. The unfairness of it burned in her chest. A soft knock at the open door interrupted her thoughts. Elizabeth turned to find Sarah Turner standing there, her baby asleep in a sling across her chest. "Miss Montgomery," Sarah said hesitantly, "may I speak with you?" "Of course, Mrs. Turner." Elizabeth gestured to one of the student desks. "Please, sit." Sarah settled herself, adjusting her sleeping infant. "I wanted to see you before the council meeting. My husband and we're grateful for what you did on the stagecoach, standing up to those bandits the way you did, keeping everyone calm." Elizabeth shook her head. "I did nothing special, Mrs. Turner." "But you did," Sarah insisted, "and now the town is treating you terribly for something that wasn't your fault." She straightened her shoulders. "I've told Sheriff Thompson I intend to speak at the council meeting, to tell them how it really was." Warmth spread through Elizabeth's chest at this unexpected alliance. "That's very brave of you, Mrs. Turner. But I wouldn't want you to face any difficulties on my account." "It's the right thing to do," Sarah said. "Simply, my husband agrees. He's not from Silver Creek originally. He understands how these small towns can be sometimes." They spoke for a few more minutes, Sarah sharing details of her journey home the previous night and how her husband had been relieved rather than scandalized by the circumstances. As she left, Elizabeth felt marginally more hopeful. Perhaps there were still reasonable voices in Silver Creek. By 11:30, Elizabeth made her way to the town hall, a modest building that served multiple purposes in the small community. Already a crowd had gathered, far larger than the typical attendance for council meetings. Word had spread, and it seemed everyone in Silver Creek wanted to witness her public judgment. Inside, the main chamber was arranged with the council's table at the front. 5 chairs for the council members, with Mayor Wilson's slightly larger chair in the center. Rows of benches faced this makeshift tribunal, already filling with townspeople. Elizabeth slipped into a seat in the front row, ignoring the whispers that followed her. She focused on calming her breathing, on preparing the words she would use to defend herself. Education, logic, reason, these had always been her tools. Surely they would serve her now. At precisely noon, the council members filed in. Mayor Wilson led the procession, followed by Edward Porter from the bank, Dr. Miller, the town's physician, Thomas Blackwood, who owned the mercantile, and finally, Reverend Spencer from the Methodist Church. Each man nodded gravely to the assembled crowd before taking their seats. "This special session of the Silver Creek Town Council is now in session," Mayor Wilson announced, rapping a small gavel. "We are gathered to discuss the events of yesterday, specifically the situation involving our schoolteacher, Miss Elizabeth Montgomery." The formal phrasing made it sound like a trial, which Elizabeth supposed it essentially was. Miss Montgomery, Mayor Wilson continued, please rise and address the council. Elizabeth stood, straightening her shoulders and meeting each council member's gaze directly. Gentlemen of the council, citizens of Silver Creek, I understand there is concern about yesterday's events. I welcome the opportunity to address any questions and to clarify what occurred. Mayor Wilson nodded, his expression stern. Please recount the events that led to you spending time unchaperoned at the Hayes Ranch. The deliberate mischaracterization ignited Elizabeth's temper, but she kept her voice level. With respect, Mayor Wilson, I was not unchaperoned at any time. Mrs. Collins, Mr. Hayes's housekeeper, was present throughout, as were Mrs. Turner and Mr. Pearson from the stagecoach. She proceeded to recount the day's events factually. The stagecoach journey, the attack by the Wilson gang, Mason's timely rescue, and the practical decision to seek shelter at his nearby ranch rather than risk further travel with injured passengers. At all times, propriety was maintained, she concluded. Mr. Hayes behaved as a gentleman, offering shelter and protection in an emergency situation. I fail to see how this constitutes any impropriety on anyone's part. Dr. Miller leaned forward. Miss Montgomery, did you change clothing while at the Hayes Ranch? Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks at the direct question. My traveling dress was soiled during our escape. Mrs. Collins provided a clean dress belonging to Mr. Hayes's sister while mine was being laundered. Again, all with proper privacy and decorum. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mason Hayes having a sister was apparently news to many in attendance. Reverend Spencer cleared his throat. The issue, Miss Montgomery, is not merely one of technical propriety, but of appearance. A school teacher holds a position of moral authority. Children and parents must have absolute confidence in your character. I understand that, Reverend. Elizabeth replied, but surely my character should be judged by my actions over the 18 months I've served this community, not by circumstances beyond my control during an emergency. Before the Reverend could respond, the door at the back of the hall opened. A hush fell over the room as Mason Hayes himself entered, removing his hat as he stepped inside. He was dressed more formally than Elizabeth had ever seen him, in a clean, dark suit that suggested he had once moved in more refined circles than a cattle ranch. Every head turned to watch as he made his way down the center aisle, his expression unreadable but his purpose evident in his deliberate stride. Elizabeth felt her heart skip as he approached the council table. Mayor Wilson's face darkened. Mr. Hayes, this is a town council matter. Your presence is not required. On the contrary, Mayor, Mason replied, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Since my name and reputation are clearly central to these proceedings, I believe I have every right to address this council. A current of whispers rippled through the town hall as Mason Hayes stood before the council table. His unexpected appearance had transformed the proceeding from a one-sided judgment to something far less predictable. Mayor Wilson recovered quickly, his face settling into practiced diplomacy. Very well, Mr. Hayes. The council will hear your statement, though I remind you this is not a formal hearing, but a community discussion of a sensitive matter. Mason's expression remained impassive. Thank you, Mayor Wilson. I'll be brief. He turned slightly, addressing not just the council, but the assembled townspeople. Yesterday, my ranch hands and I intervened in a stagecoach robbery by the Wilson gang. We provided shelter to the victims, including your schoolteacher, until word could be sent to town. At all times, propriety was maintained. His voice carried authority without aggression, the tone of a man accustomed to being heard. Miss Montgomery conducted herself with dignity and courage throughout a traumatic ordeal. Any suggestion that her character is compromised by these events is not only false, but unjust. His gaze swept the council members. I'm disappointed that Silver Creek would repay her dedicated service with suspicion rather than gratitude that she survived. Thomas Blackwood from the Mercantile shifted uncomfortably. No one's questioning your account of the robbery, Hayes. It's the aftermath that concerns us. The aftermath, Mason repeated flatly. You mean the fact that Miss Montgomery changed out of a dirt-covered dress into clean clothing provided by my housekeeper? Or perhaps you mean the 4 hours she spent in my home, in the company of 3 other stage passengers and my staff, before your rescue party arrived? Several people in the audience exchanged glances. When stated so plainly, the impropriety seemed increasingly absurd. Mayor Wilson cleared his throat. Mr. Hayes, you may not be familiar with the standards to which we hold our school teacher. I'm quite familiar with arbitrary standards, Mayor, Mason interrupted, a new edge to his voice. I've witnessed them applied differently depending on the person's standing in the community. He gestured toward Elizabeth. Miss Montgomery has served this town admirably. She deserves better than this public inquisition. Elizabeth felt a surge of gratitude mingled with apprehension. Mason's defense, while welcome, might only further link their names in the town's gossip. Dr. Miller leaned forward. The school board has certain obligations, Mr. Hayes. Parents have expressed concerns. Then allow me to propose a solution, Mason said, cutting through the doctor's explanation. He turned to face Elizabeth directly. Miss Montgomery, I believe there's a way to resolve this situation permanently if you're willing. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. Was he about to publicly offer her the teaching position at his ranch? That would only confirm the town's suspicions about their connection. Mason took a step toward her, his expression softening. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The hall erupted in gasps and exclamations. Elizabeth felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. Of all the possible interventions, this was the last she had expected. Mayor Wilson banged his gavel repeatedly. Order! Order, please! As the room gradually quieted, Elizabeth found her voice. Mr. Hayes, this is most unexpected. His grey eyes held hers steadily. It's a practical solution, Miss Montgomery. Marriage would silence any questions about propriety. You could continue teaching without the cloud of gossip, and I... He paused, something unreadable flickering across his features. I would gain a wife of intelligence and character. The clinical way he presented it, like a business arrangement, should have offended her. Yet Elizabeth recognized what he was, offering a way to preserve her position, her independence, her very place in Silver Creek. And what was he asking in return? To be tied to a woman he barely knew, surrendering his solitude, opening his private life to scrutiny before she could formulate a response. Sarah Turner rose from her seat, her baby still sleeping against her chest. If I may speak, she addressed the council, I was on that stagecoach. I witnessed everything that happened at Mr. Hayes's ranch. Miss Montgomery acted with perfect propriety throughout. She took a breath, gathering courage. But more importantly, she kept my baby and me calm during the robbery when bullets were flying past our heads. If Silver Creek loses her as a teacher over this manufactured scandal, it would be a terrible injustice. Reverend Spencer studied Sarah thoughtfully. Mrs. Turner, your testimony is valuable. However, the proposal Mr. Hayes has just made rather suggests there may be existing feelings between them that lend credence to concerns. With respect, Reverend, Mason replied, my proposal is motivated by practicality, not sentiment. Miss Montgomery's reputation is being questioned because she spent time under my roof. Marriage resolves that concern decisively. He glanced at Elizabeth. I'm offering a solution, not a romance. The blunt statement silenced the room. Elizabeth felt a confusing mixture of relief and something that might have been disappointment. Her rational mind recognized the logic of his proposal. A marriage of convenience to silence the gossips and preserve her position, yet some small, foolish part of her flinched at his clinical framing. Edward Porter, the banker, spoke for the first time. "This is highly irregular, but I must admit, it would resolve the immediate concern." He looked to his fellow council members. If Miss Montgomery were to become Mrs. Hayes, the question of propriety becomes moot. Mayor Wilson appeared less convinced. A hasty marriage might only confirm that something improper occurred. "Nothing improper occurred," Elizabeth stated firmly, finding her voice at last. "And I have not yet accepted Mr. Hayes's proposal." All eyes turned to her. In the expectant silence, Elizabeth gathered her thoughts. The situation was absurd, being pushed toward marriage to a near stranger to appease small-town sensibilities. Yet losing her position, her independence, her very purpose in Silver Creek over unfounded gossip seemed equally unacceptable. "Mr. Hayes," she said carefully, "while I appreciate your unconventional solution, I would need to consider such a significant decision." Mason nodded, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Of course, it's not a proposal that should be accepted lightly." Reverend Spencer leaned forward. "Perhaps a brief recess would be appropriate. This unexpected development changes the nature of our discussion considerably." Mayor Wilson nodded, seemingly relieved by the suggestion. "The council will recess for 30 minutes. Miss Montgomery, you may use my office for private consideration if you wish." As the mayor banged his gavel, the hall erupted in excited conversation. Elizabeth rose from her seat, legs unsteady beneath her. Mason inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement before stepping back to allow her passage. The mayor's office was a small but well-appointed room adjacent to the main hall. Elizabeth closed the door behind her, grateful for a moment of privacy to collect her whirling thoughts. She moved to the window, staring out at Silver Creek's main street without really seeing it. Marriage to Mason Hayes, a man she had exchanged perhaps 50 words with before yesterday's fateful journey. Yet she couldn't deny there was something compelling about him. His quiet capability, his evident intelligence, the glimpses of a more complex past than Silver Creek suspected. And there had been moments, brief but undeniable, when a current of connection had passed between them. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Mayor Wilson or perhaps Harriet. Instead, Sarah Turner entered, her baby now awake and blinking sleepily. "Miss Montgomery, forgive the intrusion," Sarah said, closing the door behind her, "but I thought you might appreciate a woman's perspective in this unusual situation." Elizabeth smiled gratefully. "Please, sit, and thank you for speaking up on my behalf." Sarah settled into a chair, adjusting her baby on her lap. "It was only the truth, but this proposal, it's quite something, isn't it?" "It's madness," Elizabeth admitted, sinking into the chair opposite. "Marriage to a man I barely know, to satisfy the town's questionable moral standards." "Is it truly madness, though?" Sarah asked gently. "I've been thinking about it during the recess. Mr. Hayes offers you a respectable position as his wife. You keep your teaching job, you gain security." "And what does he gain?" Elizabeth countered. "That's what I can't understand. Why would he offer marriage to resolve a situation that affects me far more than him?" Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "I can't claim to know Mr. Hayes's mind, but during those hours at his ranch, I noticed how he watched you. There was interest there, even before this scandal erupted." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. "That's hardly basis for marriage." "Perhaps not," Sarah agreed. "But is it any less basis than the carefully negotiated matches that bring most couples together? My own marriage was arranged by my father, with my husband's family, after precisely 2 chaperoned meetings." "And are you happy?" Elizabeth asked softly. A genuine smile lit Sarah's face. "Very much so. We grew into love, even if we didn't begin with it. She reached over to touch Elizabeth's hand. I'm not saying you should accept, only that such arrangements can lead to contentment, even happiness, with the right people. Before Elizabeth could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Mason himself who entered after Elizabeth's acknowledgement. Excuse me, Mrs. Turner, he said politely. Might I have a moment with Miss Montgomery? Sarah nodded, rising with her baby. Of course, I'll wait outside. When the door closed, an awkward silence fell between them. Mason remained standing, his hat in his hands, a position that struck Elizabeth as oddly vulnerable for such an imposing man. I owe you an apology, Miss Montgomery, he began, surprising her. My proposal was abrupt, perhaps even presumptuous. It was unexpected, Elizabeth acknowledged, but I understand your intention was to help resolve an impossible situation. Mason nodded, his expression serious. That was part of it, but not all. He took a step closer. The truth is, I've observed you in town for months, your dedication to your students, your intelligence, your integrity. I've admired those qualities from a distance. The confession startled her. You've noticed me? It would be difficult not to notice the only educated Eastern woman in Silver Creek, he replied, a hint of warmth breaking through his reserve. Especially one who stands up to Harriet Wilson's social dictates with such quiet dignity. Elizabeth felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest. Mr. Hayes. Mason, he corrected gently. If you're considering becoming my wife, perhaps my given name would be appropriate. Mason, she amended, the name feeling strange on her tongue. This is still an extraordinary proposition. We hardly know each other. True enough, he acknowledged, but I believe we could build a compatible life. You would maintain your independence. I have no interest in a wife who is not her own person. You could continue teaching either in town or for the children at my ranch. He paused, choosing his words carefully. It would be a partnership, Miss Montgomery, one based on mutual respect and practical benefit. And other aspects of marriage? Elizabeth asked, finding courage to address what remained unspoken between them. Mason's expression remained steady, though she detected a slight tension in his shoulders. I would expect nothing you were not willing to give, on any timeline. The arrangement could be as formal or as conventional as you wished it to be. The frank discussion of such intimate matters should have scandalized her, yet Elizabeth found his directness refreshing after the veiled language and insinuations of the council. You're offering me a great deal of consideration, she observed. What do you expect in return? Something shifted in his grey eyes, a glimpse of vulnerability quickly masked. Companionship, perhaps. Someone of intelligence to share conversation with. A respected wife to help manage social obligations I've too long neglected. He hesitated. And an end to the solitude that has, I find, outlived its usefulness in my life. The simple honesty of his final statement touched her unexpectedly. This wasn't a declaration of passion, but it held something equally compelling, the truth of a solitary man acknowledging his need for human connection. The council reconvenes in 10 minutes, Elizabeth said softly. I still don't know what my answer will be. Mason nodded, reaching for the door. Whatever you decide, I'll respect your choice. He paused, his hand on the latch. But know this, Miss Montgomery, whether as my wife or simply as Silver Creek schoolteacher, you have my highest esteem. As the door closed behind him, Elizabeth turned back to the window, her mind racing with possibilities she had never imagined when she awoke that morning. Outside, Silver Creek continued its Saturday business, unaware that inside the mayor's office a woman stood at a crossroads that would irrevocably alter her life's path, whichever direction she chose. The council chamber had filled beyond capacity during the recess. Word of Mason Hayes's unexpected marriage proposal had spread through Silver Creek with supernatural speed, drawing curious onlookers who normally had no interest in town governance. When Elizabeth re-entered the hall, the noise subsided to tense expectation, all eyes following her progress to the front row. Mason stood near the side wall, his tall figure easy to spot despite the crowd. Their eyes met briefly across the room. His expression offered encouragement without pressure, a silent reassurance that whatever she decided, he would accept. Mayor Wilson called the session back to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. This council will now resume its consideration of the situation regarding Miss Montgomery. He cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. In light of Mr. Hayes's unexpected proposal, the nature of our discussion has changed considerably. Miss Montgomery, have you reached a decision regarding this proposition? Elizabeth rose slowly, keenly aware that this moment would define her future in Silver Creek. Her hands were steady, though her heart pounded against her ribs with military precision. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, citizens of Silver Creek, she began, her teacher's voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. I have considered Mr. Hayes's proposal carefully. Before I give my answer, I wish to make several points clear. She straightened her shoulders, scanning the faces before her. First, I maintain that nothing improper occurred during yesterday's events. I was the victim of an attempted robbery, rescued by Mr. Hayes, and given appropriate shelter during an emergency. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but she continued undeterred. Second, the fact that this council would question my moral character based on these circumstances rather than commending my survival and Mr. Hayes's bravery speaks to a troubling double standard. Had I been a male teacher caught in the same situation, we would not be gathered here today. Several women in the audience nodded in agreement, though most quickly stopped when their husbands frowned. Third, Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining strength. While I value my position as Silver Creek's teacher, I value my integrity more. I will not allow false perceptions to dictate life-altering decisions. Mayor Wilson shifted uncomfortably. Miss Montgomery, these philosophical points are well taken, but the council requires your answer regarding Mr. Hayes's proposal. Elizabeth met his gaze directly. I'm approaching that answer, Mayor Wilson, but context matters. She took a deep breath. Having said all this, I have decided to accept Mr. Hayes's proposal. A collective gasp went up from the assembly, followed by a buzz of excited whispers. Elizabeth held up her hand for silence. I accept not because I feel forced by this council or town opinion, but because Mr. Hayes has offered a partnership based on mutual respect and compatible goals. We may not have the traditional courtship society expects, but we have something perhaps more valuable: honesty about our expectations and a shared vision of what marriage might be. From his position against the wall, Mason straightened, his expression shifting from neutral to something warmer, a hint of admiration in his grey eyes. Reverend Spencer leaned forward. Miss Montgomery, while I'm pleased a resolution has been found, marriage is a sacred covenant before God, not merely a pragmatic arrangement. Are you certain this is the path God intends for you? Elizabeth met the Reverend's concerned gaze. Reverend Spencer, throughout history, marriages have begun for countless reasons: political alliances, financial security, family connections. Many find their way to love and devotion despite unconventional beginnings. I believe what matters is the commitment two people make to honor and respect each other, whatever circumstances bring them together. The Reverend nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with her thoughtful response. Mayor Wilson cleared his throat. Well, this is unexpected, but it certainly resolves the council's immediate concerns. He glanced at his fellow council members, who nodded in agreement. Mr. Hayes, do you wish to address the council regarding this development? Mason stepped forward, his movements deliberate and controlled. I thank the council for recognizing our decision. Miss Montgomery honors me with her acceptance. He paused, his gaze sweeping the assembled townspeople. I expect Silver Creek will now put aside any lingering questions about yesterday's events and treat my future wife with the respect she deserves. The subtle warning in his tone was unmistakable. Several council members shifted uncomfortably under his steady gaze. Of course, Mayor Wilson replied hastily. Miss Montgomery's position as schoolteacher remains secure with the council's blessing. Harriet Wilson, seated in the second row, wore an expression of sour disappointment. Her plans for Victoria Palmer had been thoroughly dismantled. When would you propose this wedding take place? Edward Porter asked, his banker's mind clearly calculating the propriety timeline. Before either Elizabeth or Mason could answer, Reverend Spencer intervened. Given the circumstances, I would recommend a swift ceremony. Perhaps next Saturday would be appropriate. He looked between the unlikely couple. That would allow time for basic preparations while ending any lingering speculation. 1 week. Elizabeth felt a flutter of panic at the compressed timeline. 1 week to prepare for marriage to a man she was only beginning to know. Mason looked to her, clearly leaving the decision in her hands. Miss Montgomery, would that timing suit you? All eyes in the chamber focused on her. Elizabeth straightened, her shoulders. Next Saturday would be acceptable, Reverend Spencer. Excellent, the Reverend nodded. I'll make the necessary preparations. The ceremony can take place at the church at 4 o'clock. Mayor Wilson brought his gavel down with finality. Then this matter is resolved to everyone's satisfaction. This special session of the town council is adjourned. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excited conversation about the unexpected engagement, Elizabeth remained seated, a curious numbness spreading through her limbs. She had just agreed to marry a man she barely knew, to become mistress of a ranch she had visited once, to transform her carefully ordered life into something entirely unpredictable. Mason approached, stopping a respectful distance from her seat. Miss Montgomery, may I escort you somewhere more private? I imagine we have much to discuss. Elizabeth nodded, grateful for his sensitivity to her stunned state. Yes, thank you. As they moved toward the exit, townspeople openly stared, some offering awkward congratulations, others simply watching with undisguised curiosity. Harriet Wilson made a point of turning her back as they passed, a petty gesture that under other circumstances might have amused Elizabeth. Outside, the afternoon. Sun was bright after the dim interior of the town hall. Mason guided her toward a small garden behind the church, where a bench sat beneath a cottonwood tree, offering relative privacy. Are you all right? He asked once they were seated, genuine concern in his voice. I'm not entirely sure, Elizabeth admitted, her composure finally slipping now that they were away from prying eyes. I just agreed to marry a man I've spoken with perhaps 3 times in my life. It's rather overwhelming. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. When you put it that way, it does sound rather impulsive. Impulsive isn't a word often used to describe me, Elizabeth said with a shaky laugh. I've planned every step of my life. Since I was 16, education, teaching certificate, the move west, and now... She gestured vaguely. Now you've agreed to marry the town's mysterious recluse to escape a scandal, Mason finished for her. Not exactly part of your careful plan. No, she acknowledged, though I meant what I said in there. I'm not accepting out of desperation or coercion. There's something compelling about the partnership you've proposed. Mason studied her face, his grey eyes thoughtful. We have a week before the ceremony. I suggest we use it to become better. Acquainted, he paused, then added, I have no intention of rushing you into any aspect of marriage you're not comfortable with, Elizabeth. The use of her given name sent an unexpected warmth through her. Thank you for that reassurance, Mason. His name still felt foreign on her tongue, but not unpleasantly so. There are practical matters to discuss, he continued. Where we'll live, how your teaching duties will continue, what you might need from town before moving to the ranch. Elizabeth hadn't considered these immediate logistical questions. So focused had she been on the larger life change. The school term ends in 3 weeks. Perhaps I could remain at the boarding house until then. It would give me time to complete my teaching obligations and prepare the children for the summer break. Mason nodded. A sensible approach. After the ceremony, I can return to the ranch during the week and come to town on weekends until the term ends. He hesitated, then added, though that arrangement may fuel further gossip about the nature of our marriage. Let them gossip, Elizabeth said with sudden firmness. We know the truth, and that's what matters. A genuine smile transformed Mason's usually stern features. I believe I'm going to enjoy being married to you, Elizabeth Montgomery. The simple statement, delivered with unexpected warmth, eased some of the tension coiled in her chest. Hayes, she corrected softly. Elizabeth Hayes, soon enough. Indeed. He rose from the bench, offering his hand to help her up. Would you do me the honor of dining with me this evening? The hotel restaurant is the closest Silver Creek has to a formal establishment. We should make our first public appearance as an engaged couple somewhere suitably respectable. Elizabeth placed her hand in his, noting how her smaller fingers disappeared into his calloused palm. Dinner would be lovely, though I should warn you, we'll be the center of attention. I'm becoming accustomed to that, he replied dryly as they began walking toward the main street. After years of deliberate obscurity, I've managed to become the talk of Silver Creek twice in 24 hours. Does that bother you? Elizabeth asked, genuinely curious about this private man who had voluntarily thrust himself into the town's spotlight for her sake. Mason considered the question seriously. Solitude was a choice I made for specific reasons after the war, but perhaps it's time for a change. He glanced down at her. Some things are worth the discomfort of public scrutiny. As they parted at the boarding house steps, Mason to secure dinner reservations, Elizabeth to prepare for the evening, she found herself contemplating his words. This unlikely engagement, born of crisis and scandal, contained seeds of something she hadn't expected, possibility. She had agreed to the marriage primarily to preserve her position and dignity in Silver Creek. But as she selected her best dress for dinner, Elizabeth admitted to herself that something else had influenced her decision as well. Curiosity about the complex, intelligent man behind Mason Hayes's reserved exterior, and the inexplicable connection that had sparked between them during their brief interactions. 1 week to their wedding day, 7 days to transform from strangers to husband and wife. The task seemed impossible, yet as Elizabeth pinned her hair more elaborately than usual for their dinner, she felt an unexpected flutter of anticipation. Beneath her practical considerations, this was not the path she had planned, but perhaps, just perhaps, it might lead somewhere worth exploring. The next morning, Sunday, Elizabeth awoke to the church bells calling Silver Creek's faithful to worship. She dressed with particular care, knowing that all eyes would be upon her, the schoolteacher who had caused a scandal and secured an unexpected engagement in the span of 24 hours. Last night's dinner at the hotel restaurant had confirmed her predictions. They had been the center of attention, with conversations pausing as they entered and resuming in hushed tones as they passed. Yet Mason had handled the scrutiny with surprising grace, maintaining an air of dignified indifference while treating her with courteous attention. Their conversation had focused primarily on practical matters, the wedding arrangements, her teaching, schedule, the logistics of eventually moving her possessions to the ranch. But occasionally they had ventured into more personal territory, discovering shared interests in literature and history. Mason, she learned, maintained an extensive library and subscribed to several Eastern newspapers and journals. He read Shakespeare for pleasure and had strong opinions on the westward expansion policies of the current administration. Each such revelation had shifted her perception of him slightly, adding layers to the enigmatic figure Silver Creek had. Labeled a dangerous recluse, as Elizabeth pinned her hat securely and checked her appearance in the small mirror above her dresser, she wondered what new facets of Mason Hayes's character might be revealed in the coming week. The pews were already filling when Elizabeth arrived at the church. She hesitated in the vestibule, suddenly uncertain where to sit. Her usual place was midway down on the right side, but would Mason join her? Should she wait for him? The decision was made for her when Sarah Turner appeared at her elbow. "Miss Montgomery, or should I say the future Mrs. Hayes, would you care to join us?" She gestured to where her husband stood nearby, their baby bundled in his arms. "Thank you. That would be lovely," Elizabeth replied, grateful for the friendly overture. They moved toward the Turners' pew. Elizabeth spotted Mason entering the church. His dark suit was impeccably pressed, his usually unruly hair neatly combed. When their eyes met, he inclined his head in greeting and moved to join them, ignoring the whispers that followed his progress. "Mr. Hayes," Sarah's husband greeted him, with a firm handshake. "David Turner, I understand I owe you my wife and son's safety." "No debt exists between us, Mr. Turner," Mason replied. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," David said meaningfully, "and certainly not with the same effectiveness. The stage driver told me how you handled those bandits." Before the conversation could continue, Reverend Spencer approached their pew, his expression brightening at the sight of Mason. "Mr. Hayes, what a pleasant surprise. It's been some time since you've joined us for worship." "Special circumstances call for special observances, Reverend," Mason replied, his tone respectful but reserved. The Reverend turned to Elizabeth, his smile warming further. "Miss Montgomery, I wonder if you and Mr. Hayes might meet with me after the service. A brief discussion about the ceremony would be beneficial." "Of course, Reverend," Elizabeth agreed, conscious of neighboring parishioners leaning slightly closer to overhear. As the service began, Elizabeth found herself hyper-aware of Mason beside her, the subtle scent of shaving soap, the controlled power in his tall frame, the way his deep voice joined the hymns with unexpected confidence. He knew the words without referring to the hymnal, she noted with surprise. The Reverend's sermon, drawn from the Book of Ruth, seemed almost deliberately chosen for their situation. He spoke eloquently of unexpected journeys, of finding belonging in foreign circumstances, of loyalty and commitment transcending conventional beginnings. When he concluded with Ruth's famous pledge, "Where you go, I will go," Elizabeth felt Mason's gaze briefly touch her profile. After the final hymn, as the congregation began dispersing, Harriet Wilson made a deliberate path to their pew, her husband, the mayor, trailing behind with a resigned expression. "Miss Montgomery, Mr. Hayes," she greeted them, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Such a lovely surprise to see you in church together. One might almost think you'd been courting secretly for months." The insinuation was clear, that their sudden engagement confirmed inappropriate prior relations. Mason stepped slightly forward, positioning himself subtly between Elizabeth and Harriet. "Mrs. Wilson, your concern for propriety is admirable, almost as admirable as your dedication to local gossip." Harriet's smile froze. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "I believe you do," Mason replied, his tone conversational but with steel. "Beneath And now that Miss Montgomery is to become my wife, I trust that certain speculations about her character will cease immediately." Mayor Wilson placed a hand on his wife's arm. "Congratulations to you both. Harriet, I believe the Andersons were hoping to discuss the charity bazaar with you." With a tight smile and a nod that could barely be considered civil, Harriet allowed herself to be led away. "That woman," Sarah muttered as they departed, "could find scandal in a prayer meeting." Elizabeth suppressed a smile. "Thank you," she said quietly to Mason, "though I fear you've made an enemy." "Harriet Wilson was never going to be a friend," he replied calmly. "And I meant what I said. As my wife, you'll be accorded proper respect, or those failing to do so will answer to me." The protective declaration should have bothered her independent spirit, yet Elizabeth found herself touched by his concern. "I've managed Harriet Wilson for 18 months, she reminded him gently. "And done so admirably," Mason acknowledged with a hint of a smile. "But marriage should offer certain advantages, including shared battles when necessary." Their meeting with Reverend Spencer was brief but informative. The ceremony would be simple but dignified: vows, rings, a short homily on the nature of marriage. The Reverend tactfully addressed the compressed timeline. "While these circumstances are unusual," he noted, "I'm pleased to see you both approaching the union with appropriate seriousness. Marriage begun in pragmatism can grow into genuine devotion with time and mutual respect." "That's our intention, Reverend," Mason assured him. As they exited the church into the bright midday sun, Mason hesitated, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "I have errands in town this afternoon, but I wondered if you might be available for supper. There are matters we should discuss before the wedding." Elizabeth nodded, curious about his suddenly serious tone. "Mrs. Davis serves boarding-house supper at 6, but I could meet you after." "I'll call for you at 7 then," Mason agreed. They parted ways on the church steps, Elizabeth returning to the boarding-house while Mason headed toward the telegraph office. As she walked, Elizabeth pondered the matters he wished to discuss. Financial arrangements, perhaps, or more delicate subjects related to marriage expectations. The afternoon passed slowly. Elizabeth attempted to review her students' essays, but found her mind wandering repeatedly to the upcoming evening. At 6, she joined the other boarders for Mrs. Davis's Sunday supper, enduring their poorly disguised curiosity and occasional direct questions about her sudden engagement. "It's all very romantic," sighed Miss Winters, the milliner's assistant. "Rescued from bandits by a mysterious rancher, then engaged within a day." "Very practical, more like," countered Mr. Holloway, a clerk at the Mercantile. "Hayes needs a wife to manage his household properly, and Miss Montgomery needs—" He trailed off, suddenly remembering he was speaking to Elizabeth directly. "Security and respectability," Elizabeth supplied dryly. "Yes, Mr. Holloway, ours is a practical arrangement in many ways, but I believe the best marriages often are." She excused herself early to prepare for Mason's arrival, changing into her green silk dress, her finest, saved for special occasions. As she fastened the small pearl earrings that had been her mother's, Elizabeth studied her reflection. At 23, she was still young, though the frontier aged women quickly. Her chestnut hair was her best feature, thick and wavy when not severely pinned back. Her eyes, hazel and intelligent, looked back at her with a mixture of apprehension and determination. In 1 week, she would be Elizabeth Hayes, wife to a man Silver Creek whispered about but didn't truly know. The thought was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. Mason arrived precisely at 7, his punctuality another data point in her growing understanding of his character. He had changed into a different suit than his church attire, charcoal, grey that complemented his eyes, with a subtle pattern in the waistcoat that suggested Eastern tailoring. "You look lovely," he said simply as she descended the boarding house stairs. "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, feeling uncharacteristically self-conscious under his direct gaze. "Where are we going this evening?" "I hope you don't mind, but I've arranged a private dining room at the hotel," Mason explained as he offered his arm. "What I wish to discuss is best done away from Silver Creek's ever-attentive ears." The hotel's small private dining room was simply but elegantly set for two. A bottle of wine, a rarity in Silver Creek, stood open on the table, and the hotel's owner himself served their meal rather than the usual waitress, a sign of the deference Mason's wealth commanded, despite his lack of social involvement. Once they were alone with their supper, Mason seemed to gather himself, as if preparing for a difficult conversation. "Elizabeth," he began, using her given name with careful intention, "before we proceed further with this wedding, there are things about me, about my past, that you should know. Things that may cause you to reconsider your acceptance." Elizabeth set down her fork, giving him her full attention. "I'm listening." Mason's expression was grave, his grey eyes holding hers steadily. "Silver Creek has its theories about me, that I'm a former gunslinger, perhaps a criminal hiding from the law. The truth is both simpler and more complex." He reached for his wine glass but didn't drink, instead turning the stem slowly between his fingers. "I was born Mason Jonathan Hayes in Boston, 1847, to a family of some prominence in banking and shipping. I was educated at Harvard, where I studied literature and history before the war interrupted my final year." Elizabeth couldn't hide her surprise. Harvard. That explained his cultured speech, his library, his knowledge of the classics, but it contradicted everything Silver Creek believed about him. "I joined the Union Cavalry in '64, Mason continued, "and received a battlefield commission to lieutenant after Gettysburg. By war's end, I was a captain commanding a company of mounted infantry." He paused, his expression darkening. "The things I saw, the things I did during those years, changed me fundamentally. When I returned to Boston, I couldn't resume my former life as if those experiences hadn't marked me. My family expected me to join the bank, marry appropriately, fulfill my social obligations. I found I couldn't bear the superficiality of it all." Elizabeth nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "So you came west." "Not immediately," Mason corrected, gently. "First, I married Margaret Sullivan, my childhood friend and the daughter of my father's business partner." The revelation that Mason had been married before struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. She struggled to keep her expression neutral, aware that her reaction was disproportionate, given the practical nature of their own engagement. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Mason's eyes took on a distant quality, looking through her rather than at her. "Influenza in the winter of '69. Margaret and our infant son, William, died within days of each other." "I'm so sorry," Elizabeth said, genuine sympathy flooding her despite her surprise. "After their deaths, there was nothing keeping me in Boston," Mason continued after a moment. "I sold my shares in the family business, purchased land in Montana Territory sight unseen, and came west to start again where no one knew my name or my losses." His gaze refocused on her face. "The ranch has been my refuge, my purpose, and my solitude for 12 years." Elizabeth absorbed this revelation, understanding now why Mason had chosen isolation, why Silver Creek's rumors hadn't bothered him. He had been running from far more significant ghosts than local gossip. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally, "but why would this cause me to reconsider our arrangement?" Mason studied her face carefully. "Because I'm not the man Silver Creek believes me to be, for better or worse, and because I've known profound loss, Elizabeth. It changes a person in ways that aren't always visible, but run bone deep." "We've all experienced loss," Elizabeth said, softly. "Different kinds, perhaps, but loss nonetheless. She thought of her mother's death when she was 15, of leaving her father behind to pursue her teaching career, of the slow death of her Boston dreams as she adapted to frontier realities. "Yes," Mason acknowledged, "but you should know what you're agreeing to. Marriage to a man who rebuilt himself from ashes, who deliberately chose solitude until now." Elizabeth considered his words carefully. "Did you ever think you might marry again?" Before all this happened, a complicated expression crossed Mason's features. "I thought that chapter of my life was finished, yet here we are." "Here we are," Elizabeth echoed, raising her wine glass slightly. "Two unexpected chapters." Mason lifted his own glass in response, the gesture sealing something unspoken between them, an acknowledgement of shared honesty, of foundations being laid for whatever their marriage might become. Saturday arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if Montana itself approved of the union about to take place. The week had passed in a whirlwind of preparations and small, significant moments that had gradually transformed Elizabeth and Mason's pragmatic arrangement into something neither had anticipated. There had been the afternoon he'd arrived at the schoolhouse with a small wooden crate, books for her classroom that he'd ordered from Denver months ago, he explained, but which seemed particularly timely now. The delight on her students' faces as they explored the new volumes had been matched only by Elizabeth's surprise at his thoughtfulness. There had been the quiet dinner at his ranch 2 days before the wedding, where Mrs. Collins had outdone herself, preparing Elizabeth's favorite dishes, information subtly extracted by Mason during their conversations. Afterward, Mason had shown her through the house that would soon be her home, including the sunny corner bedroom he had prepared for her, separate from his own, a silent acknowledgement of the space she might need as they navigated their unusual beginning. Most meaningfully, there had been the unexpected arrival of a trunk from her father in Boston, accompanied by a letter that had brought tears to her eyes. He could not attend the wedding on such short notice, he wrote, but he sent his blessing along with her mother's wedding dress and family Bible. After years of disapproval over her Western adventure, this gesture of acceptance had healed something, long broken within her. Now, as she stood in the small anteroom of Silver Creek's church, Elizabeth smoothed the ivory satin of her mother's gown and tried to calm her racing pulse. The dress had required hasty alterations. Her mother had been shorter and slighter, but Mrs. Turner and 3 other women from town had worked miracles with needle and thread, their assistance a quiet rebuke to Harriet Wilson's continued cold shoulder. A soft knock at the door preceded Sarah Turner's entrance, her expression brightening at the sight of Elizabeth in her finery. "Oh, you look beautiful," she breathed, arranging the simple veil of Belgian lace. "Are you ready?" "The church is full to bursting." "Full?" Elizabeth hadn't expected a large gathering given the circumstances of their engagement. Sarah nodded, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Apparently, Mason Hayes's wedding is the most significant social event Silver Creek has witnessed in years. Even those who whispered behind their hands all week wouldn't miss it." Elizabeth took a steadying breath. "Then I suppose we shouldn't keep them waiting." As the first notes of the wedding march sounded on the church's small organ, Elizabeth gathered her courage and stepped into the nave. The faces that turned toward her were a blur of curiosity and surprise. Surprise, she realized, at the transformation of their practical schoolteacher into a bride of unexpected elegance. But it was Mason's face that captured and held her attention as she moved down the aisle. He stood tall and straight beside Reverend Spencer, his expression shifting from composure to something else entirely as he saw her. Wonder, perhaps, or recognition of the significance of what they were undertaking together. When she reached him, he extended his hand, warm and steady against her trembling fingers. "You are radiant," he whispered for her ears alone. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and certain in the hushed church. When Mason slipped the ring onto her finger, a band of gold, set with a small but perfect diamond that had belonged to his mother, the moment felt more profound than Elizabeth had anticipated for what had begun as a marriage of convenience. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Spencer declared with evident satisfaction. "Mr. Hayes, you may kiss your bride." A ripple of expectation went through the congregation. This was the moment that would reveal the true nature of their union, awkward formality or genuine connection. Mason's eyes met Elizabeth's, seeking permission. She gave the slightest nod, her heart suddenly racing. His hand gently cupped her cheek as he leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss. That was neither performative for their audience nor inappropriately passionate. It was instead a promise, gentle, respectful, but with an undercurrent of warmth that hinted at possibilities yet unexplored. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, Elizabeth was surprised by the genuine applause that greeted them. Whatever gossip had circulated before, Silver Creek seemed willing to embrace their union now that it was official. The reception at the hotel was livelier than either had planned. Mason, Elizabeth discovered, could be surprisingly charming when he chose to engage socially. He conversed easily with townspeople who had previously regarded him with suspicion, danced with appropriate decorum when tradition demanded, and kept a protective eye on her throughout without being overbearing. As sunset approached, they prepared to depart for the ranch. Their home now, Elizabeth reminded herself with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Mason had arranged for her belongings to be moved the previous day, including the precious books and personal mementos that defined her independent life. Sarah embraced her warmly before they left. "Write to me," she insisted, "and visit whenever you're in town. I want to hear everything about this new chapter." "I will," Elizabeth promised, grateful for the friendship that had blossomed from crisis. As Mason handed her up into the waiting carriage, Sheriff Thompson approached, his expression unusually solemn. "Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Hayes," he acknowledged them, both with a respectful nod. "Thought you should know, we captured 2 of the Wilson gang yesterday near Blackwater Creek. They're in custody awaiting the circuit judge." Mason's hand tightened slightly on Elizabeth's. "Any sign of their leader?" The sheriff shook his head. "Still at large, but with 2 of his men facing prison, it's likely he's fled the territory." "Thank you for letting us know," Elizabeth said, aware of how this news created a certain symmetry. The danger that had brought them together was diminished on their wedding day. As the carriage pulled away from Silver Creek, heading toward the ranch in the golden light of evening, Elizabeth found herself watching the town recede with complex emotions. Just over a week ago, she had been Elizabeth Montgomery, the schoolteacher whose carefully ordered life had been upended by a chance encounter with bandits and the intervention of a mysterious rancher. Now she was Elizabeth Hayes, entering a life she had never imagined, but which suddenly held promise she hadn't dared to hope for. "Having second thoughts?" Mason asked quietly, noticing her pensive expression. Elizabeth turned to him, studying the face that was becoming increasingly familiar. The strength in his jaw, the intelligence in his grey eyes, the hint of vulnerability he allowed only her to see. "Not second thoughts," she clarified, "just awareness of how quickly life can change course." Mason nodded, understanding in his gaze. "For better or worse?" "That remains to be seen," Elizabeth replied with honesty. Then, allowing a small smile, she added, "But I find myself unexpectedly optimistic." He took her gloved hand in his, a gesture that was becoming natural between them. "As am I." As the carriage crested the final ridge, the Hayes Ranch spread before them, bathed in sunset's glow. Elizabeth saw it with new eyes now, not just as a refuge following danger, but as the setting for the life they would build together, step by careful step. "Welcome home, Elizabeth," Mason said softly, and for the first time since leaving Boston years ago, home felt like exactly the right word, not because of the impressive house or prosperous ranch, but because of the man beside her who had entered her life in the most unexpected way, saving her from bandits, only to have society force a marriage that neither had sought, but which now held the seed of something genuine and rare on the Montana frontier. Partnership based on mutual respect, growing affection, and the courage to begin again. As Mason helped her from the carriage, his hand steady at her waist, Elizabeth thought of Reverend Spencer's sermon drawn from the Book of Ruth. "Where you go, I will go." Words chosen for practicality had somehow transformed into a pledge of the heart, a journey they would now travel together, no longer strangers forced by circumstance, but partners by choice in whatever adventures lay ahead. End with panoramic. A view of the ranch at sunset, the couple walking hand in hand toward their future. This remarkable story reminds us that sometimes life's most unexpected turns, even those that seem like disasters at first, can lead us precisely where we need to be. For Elizabeth and Mason, a chance encounter with danger became the catalyst for finding in each other what they didn't know they were seeking: connection, understanding, and the promise of love built day by day on the strongest of foundations. Final. Closing card with the title, "He saved her from bandits, but she was forced to marry him after town, discovered she'd spent the night." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.